Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I've been fans of the works of the presenters before me. My name is Pei Ying, and I'm the head and co-founder of Kontinentalist. And today I'll be sharing about how we've attempted in the last, especially the last 2 years, to tell all of our data stories or projects with principles of care, embracing complexity and resisting extraction. My presentation is not specific to hope, as the two presentations before were, but I will share ideas that will help us look at our world with a sense of, I guess, a solution in abundance. I started Kontinentalist in 2017 with the simple ambition to tell data stories from Asia, about Asia from our perspective. We saw ourselves as bridges between the research sector and the public. Since then, we've published over 100 pieces. Here's a sample of the work that you'll see on our website, which we are best known for. That said, we also have great content available on Instagram and LinkedIn, which we call micro stories, where we bring all of our work to where our audience is at. Lesser known is the work we produce as a studio for our clients that are of a similar vein. But today I'm here to share about how we've evolved our ethos to one that values reciprocity, not just as a principle, but methodological working process, and why we did so and what we've learned from this new practice. For the majority of our company's lifespan, our work looked largely like this: long form, evergreen, visually charged, and beautifully illustrated essays that discusses a variety of issues about Asia. We've had the great honor of collaborating with many organizations across the globe, big and small, to tell stories that drive awareness to critical issues around social justice, climate change, nature and conservation, and so on. Integral to many of our pieces is this belief that our work has to be centered in an Asian and local perspective, using data to do myth-busting work, or provide dignity and representation to cultures where mainstream media has failed to do so. I'm proud to share that this body of work has won several awards and recognition from various communities, but it still left us feeling off and disconnected very often. That was because we were telling stories from a distance, where we were not always in direct contact with the communities that we reported on and relied on others to tell us what to say, or we prioritized deadlines and visual brilliance. Ultimately, we realized that data will always be entangled with people. It is not a neutral nor naturally good form of knowledge, and decisions made from data affects humans, their bodies, and communities. Talking about community without engaging meaningfully felt hollow, so we needed to figure out how to build an ethical, values-driven practice. As a result, we knew our mission and vision had to evolve towards equity and care. Our old mission and vision was built around this ambition to redress misconceptions about our cultures and continent. Too often, we felt that news about our part of the world is dominated by a negative lens: natural disasters, poverty, corruption, frivolity, exoticization, just to name a few. If only people knew what exactly was happening and help people communicate their data was what we thought would solve the problem. But our new reflections forced us to interrogate these assumptions, which made it clear that it was no longer relevant or appropriate for what we wanted to do. We needed one that made us review our relationship with data, research, and communities, and most importantly, who we center in our stories. So in our new vision and mission, we now see ourselves as advocates for a more equitable world that fosters connections between Asia's sources of knowledge. We see ourselves as a conduit to support others, and we want to challenge data dynamics with both data and human experiences. But let me come back to the issue which we started out as an organization to address. How do we practice good data storytelling in Asia that centers communities that stories are about? Our experience informs us that there are many barriers. The usual resources that I try to learn from, books, conferences, and courses on data visualization, does not prepare me for the realities in our region. Firstly, data literacy is not great. This is even true in a place like Singapore, a country where a significant proportion of our population has at least tertiary education. They might understand what average means, but few question why it's problematic. Most of the data visualizations we use today are also strongly associated with research and white-collar work. In many parts of Asia, especially in places with significant educational and income inequalities, Eurocentric, or what we know now as conventional dataviz, is foreign. With a continent spanning all sorts of languages and billions of people, there is no general data storytelling or DataViz guidelines that is sufficient. Asia also has unique challenges to open data and freedom of information legislation. Most of the countries rank below 50% on the Open Data Index, and only a quarter of the countries have laws around freedom of information. And this brings me to my next point about power imbalances of information. This is not to say that data doesn't exist. It does, but it's not granular enough to make critical, it often isn't granular enough to make critical commentary. And in many parts of Southeast Asia, the data isn't even shared in a form that's usable. It's usually in a JPEG image. So there is also lastly distrust in data. In many countries, especially with more authoritarian regimes, data is used to serve state agendas. So people are very distrustful. A few years ago, I was on this leadership program for Southeast Asians, and I recall being so struck by how many of my fellow participants told me that they had false birth dates on their official documents. For even something as benign as birthdays, people avoid data surveillance. How can we presume any accuracy at all? Perhaps the problem isn't in what Asian societies lack, or we're looking at the issue with the wrong problem lenses, so to speak. The problem lies in the fact that data and DataViz comes from modern Western-centric development that is a long history of colonization. This practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country for economic exploitation may feel like a thing of the past, but in reality it isn't. Its ghost lingers on in coloniality, which is this long shadow that mostly colonial and European powers have left in their wake across the world and continues to do so not only informing structures of trade, economy, and labor, but most crucially, knowledge and how knowledge is produced. As this quote illustrates, coloniality lives on in the ways we treat data, the cash crop commodity of this 21st century. Data now replaces what used to be spice, cotton, or coffee. The systems and perspectives we have towards data today is fraught with this desire for comprehensibility. Knowledge or data is only legitimate if it's properly usable or properly usable if it's been verified and legitimized by institutions such as governments, organizations, and universities. And this ignores the legitimacy of other forms of knowledge, especially indigenous ones, that are equally valuable and insightful. So we need to stop thinking of data as this form of ideal knowledge. Data was invented in this modern life as a way to make our world legible to those with power. But in reality, it is an imperfect, flawed representation of our reality. Categorization and standardization is applied to ease our cognitive understanding, to make life on Earth manageable, searchable, and then usable. This process erases diversity and individuality. Data is inherently fraught with power dynamics. Who is collecting the data versus whose data is being collected? For what purpose and to what gain is it being done? Those with data wield power and knowledge. How can we reverse this dynamic or challenge it? The truth is there is no method or perfect approach to this, and it takes a lot of self-reflection and unlearning of long-held ideals and conceptions. And I will discuss a few ways we've approached this and what we have learned from it. The first is to reject this need for accuracy or certainty. In centering local knowledge and beliefs, this means not simply looking at mythical and spiritual practices as superstition or without scientific basis and merit. Instead, we treat these beliefs as reality and collect data around them as points of culture worth celebrating and acknowledging. For example, we've talked about feng shui and its origins and how these principles inform our built environment. We also looked at a spatial dataset about supernatural encounters and reframed how we look at our landscape. Neither of these would be considered accurate, but not on a scientific level at least, but our perspective is that they are just as worthy. The next is to challenge reductivism and to consider diversity, nuance, and the agency of every individual, especially in your datasets. We also aim to design with visual metaphors, imbuing emotion and dignity into our work and our stories to show that people are more than just numbers. On the left is one of the visualizations from a story we did about women and how they access leisure and how varied their experiences with leisure are with distance and time. Using an average to represent this would have significantly glossed over the individual barriers and experiences. On the right is a cultural infographic we developed for the Malay Heritage Center in Singapore. Malays are an indigenous group that is often represented in simplistic and essentialist ways, and it was important for us to design food and tradition without this exoticized lens and instead with dignity, beauty, and joy. We also have sought to center indigenous voices and experience when we work with them and use their knowledge systems as a source of design approach. In this story, Gaza lives resisting cultural genocide. It was vital for us to center Palestinians and their experiences in this project. We were essentially outsiders to this topic, so we had to partner with Visualizing Palestine and follow their lead. Our story must center Palestinian voices. So we dedicated a chapter to interviews with 5 Palestinian cultural practitioners from Gaza. These were snippets of their lives and work, showing how they are embedded in Gaza's urban and cultural fabric. For the main data visualizations, we wanted to show the scale of cultural loss in Gaza. For this, we were inspired by Palestinian designer Maya Amr, who used Tetris or Palestinian embroidery to represent the number of martyrs in the ongoing genocide. This is a dignified way of visualizing deaths instead of simply showing numbers. We asked for her permission to use her designs and expanded on the Tetris symbols for our story. Our approach to this story was heavily influenced by this quote, introduced to us by Nur, a researcher from Visualizing Palestine. To see the culture that is built is in exile recognized and celebrated in spite of its subjection to injustice, suffering, and humiliation. We felt that the mainstream press had done a sufficient job belaboring the death and destruction that has gone on in Gaza, and our contribution should be beyond this extractive pile-on where we only talk about their pain and not their joy. Palestinians and Gazans should be known and heard beyond their suffering, and even their pain should be discussed with dignity. We have also prescribed ourselves a different way and process of working in our creative process. In this example of Air Pasang Surut, a participatory exhibition we did for Hari Orang Pulau, also known as Islanders Day, a day of celebration for indigenous seafaring peoples hailing from Nusantara, the region that is today Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. This exhibition was co-designed by us and Orang Laut Singapore, an advocacy organization for the indigenous peoples of the sea. Orang Laut Singapore is no stranger to us. We've worked with them on a couple of projects before. They're also our neighbors in the same co-working space in Singapore. It might be easy to assume that we already know their work, or their pain points and their objectives. But instead, we took a slow approach. We discussed our shared objectives for this project over traditional kueh and tea, and we took care to emphasize the spaciousness and relationship building and principles of collective care. And for the exhibition, we borrowed and upcycled materials and props and conducted trial runs with them, getting their feedback about what worked and what wouldn't. This exhibition was intended as a first step of a research project to capture the effects of displacement on the Orang Laut community and other coastal communities in Singapore who have been evicted from their islands. Initially, we thought that Islanders Day would be a great opportunity to collect data since it's a gathering space for the community. But we also quickly realized that the space was celebratory in tone, and asking people for hard data about displacement might sort of strike the wrong note. Taking inspiration from principles of abundance and opting not to frame displacement only in the deficit, we designed the exhibition prompts to be open and fluid, revolving around maps, memories, and thoughts about their first home. Some prompts with a focus on embodied knowledge and memories include, what sounds do you associate with your first home? What's a dish you remember eating? Or what words describe your relationship to the sea? Our exhibition focused on celebrating what the community has and being a space for their stories and sharings. So in a way, our research objectives became secondary. Of course, we've not lost sight of our longer term aims, which is to conduct a deeper research into displacement and its effects in the future, information that is important for Orang Laut Singapore's advocacy work as well. But for the purposes of this exhibition, we did not want to have an extractive relationship with both the data we collect and the community that we are taking from. We didn't want to take what we are looking for data-wise and then leave. For us, it was important chance to build trust. Orang Laut narratives have been largely erased from the state, and forced displacement and assimilation into wider Malay community has led to disempowerment and marginalization of their culture. So it's very important for us to embark on a research and data collection exercise where we don't inadvertently reinforce extractive practices. Collecting more data doesn't correct this problem, as it can lead to further intellectual exploitation of indigenous narratives with no sustained material betterment to their lives. We've also been drawing on indigenous methodologies for our own approaches, as we did in one of our newest works, A Line of Our Own Drawing. This is a work commissioned by the Singapore Art Museum that responds to an art installation by an artist called Tan Pin Pin that's about walking as a social action. So for this, we decided to explore the theme of desire paths. Desire paths are these unofficial paths we find in fields or grassy areas created by people who want to bypass the so-called official route. So you've probably seen this before. Conventional cartography and mapping tend to view environments as static and controllable. But desire paths are living examples of agency, deviance, and human expressions in the wild. Hence, we felt it was apt to embrace walking as a research method informed by indigenous and decolonial perspectives to research. Although walking is not exclusive to indigenous communities, they hold it as a process for knowledge sharing and counter mapping, believing in embodied experiences to understanding our world. We conducted fieldwork in 4 sites across Singapore and worked in pairs to find desire paths in our chosen sites of study and documented our experience in the following ways. While we had the technical data-focused queries, we also wanted to document our experience and made sure to capture how we felt, what we thought, and even if they were expressions of discomfort or uncertainty or something witty and random. This formed the knowledge that we collected through walking, creating this embodied decolonial and counter mapping experience. So while we were on a mission to gather information, we also prioritized being present with our environment, walking in pairs for solidarity and safety, and remembering to respect the sanctity of space. Going back to this exhibition itself, we incorporated ourselves into the work, where the names of our teams were also printed on the wall as researchers of the respective sites. We annotated the work with our thoughts and feelings, as well as speculations about why certain desire paths formed. Instead of thinking ourselves as separate observers to this phenomenon, we included ourselves explicitly. We wanted to lean onto principles of entanglement and communicated that as our methodology, one that is embodied and necessarily speculative. So what do we learn from this? Building relationships and not transactions. We now have a community manifesto in our team that guides how we hold all of our relationships, be it readers, stakeholders, partners, and clients. And we focus on reciprocity and question sources and power rather than thinking of community development only as this natural benevolent good. Questioning what is the most valuable intervention. We also always ask now if what we're doing is the right solution or the right intervention for what is at stake. Does this issue or community require yet another story, yet another artwork? Even if the answer is yes, how can we do it in a way that centers their experiences? Lastly, exploring more caring and collective ways to support the work we care about. Creative work produced in pain has little joy, and we want to think about how we can continue what we do with principles of care. So I'll conclude my sharing here with some final questions and reflections to share that might guide your own journey in your work if you find yourself in similar conundrums to us. Who benefits from the data we might collect and share, and who might be harmed or left out? Are we reinforcing extractive practices even unintentionally? What does care look like in our engagements, and how do we stay accountable to the communities whose stories that we are telling about? That's it for my talk, and please follow us on our various social media platforms. Thank you.